Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back to Think Up. And I'm here with Prashant, and he and I are going to have a conversation about something quite interesting, actually. I don't even know how to categorize this conversation. So I'm going to pass over to Prashant to explain why we came across this as a topic to discuss. Over to you, mate.
Wow. Well, about the beginning of the lockdown, I decided that I wanted to learn Latin, and then I came across Duolingo, which is an app that helps you learn languages through interactivity. And I started using the app, not really expecting anything to come out of it. But then, as I progressed, I found that I was actually developing kind of an interactive connection, an intuitive connection with the language, to the point where I could now. I'm at a point where I can now read passages from Latin poems and all that sort of thing. So it seems to be going in some sort of direction. So and the whole paradox of this whole thing is that technology is helping me learn something ancient, and all that kind of thing. So and it's really, it's just one of those experiments in self-learning. And when you learn a language, you begin with, when you actually start learning a language, you don't start with the grammar. You start interacting. You start in an interactive setting, and then you eventually move on to the grammar. Because if you just learn verbs and declensions, you're going to only know verbs and declensions. You won't be able to read anything in it, or
Yeah. I have a personal preference that is along those lines, but there is an argument that I'm trying to be as balanced and fair as possible about this. I could have started it with another way around without showing a preference. Okay, there is one school of thought that says that the best way of learning something is to learn the constructs theoretically, and then apply those constructs theoretically to a more creative approach. So let's take a musical instrument. When I learned the piano, I did all the grades on the piano from a theoretical basis, and then I hated it year after year after year. I hated doing it, but when I learned the guitar, I did the opposite. So I self-taught myself on guitar, loved the process, and then eventually arrived at the Guildhall School of Music in my mid-teens, and then then learned the theory, and then realized what I was doing that could be even more improved. But it was the opposite of my piano learning. It's the reason I play less piano now is because every time I sit at the piano, what I remember most is theory. When I pick up a guitar, what I remember most is creativity. Although I'm good on both instruments, it just kind of went in two different directions. So would you say that prior to this learning experience, you would have been along the theory second approach, or were you first kind of like a theory initially, a prioritized approach?
I suppose I always had a kind of sense of, I always had a sense that grammar is necessary. But I think it should be the second step, because grammar, if you start with grammar, it makes you self-conscious. So when you're trying to translate a sentence, so for example, there are these tricky sentences in Latin. Let's see. I think volumine invenire volumus. I want to find the books.
Yes.
But it's a tricky, to literally translate, and you'll be all over the place when even though it's a short type of sentence, you'll be all over the place trying to translate this, and But whereas if you're just doing this sentence after sentence, it's kind of getting pinged in your head, and you're getting sort of habituated to it.
Yeah, and so when I was learning, I've learned quite a number of languages for one reason or another, and the bits and pieces of Latin that I think I created a learning structure for Latin mistakenly that it turned out to be quite useful. And I started looking at the punctuation to begin with, then analysing the verbs, which is kind of how I've looked at most languages, is starting with the verbs, looking at the punctuation, looking at the verbs, so actually the action points, the doing bits, and then identifying any other constructions around it. And then specifically with Latin and Latin languages, I found that finding out what the main clause is and then finding out what the sub-clause is, kind of works in a methodological fashion. Kind of, it's like looking at a house and you see a house. Yeah, I kind of get the fact that it's a blue house with white windows. And the Latin version of that is the windows aren't actually a supporting, the windows are kind of a sub-heading of the foundation that it's actually, that's holding the whole thing up. And Latin especially, and Latin languages, seem to lean very neatly into that kind of structure. So it's not necessarily grammatical theory starting point, it's kind of logic. I see it's kind of like, what is this actually about? And then what the building blocks on top of what it's really about. That's how I've found it.
Well, I mean, to an extent, what I found is good about this is that, I mean, you do slip up several times along the way. It's kind of, I think it's a difference between, let's say, if you're going to climb a rock, and then you stand at the base of the rock and you plan a strategy about how you're going to climb it, whereas you actually just start climbing it and you slip, you start scrape your knee several times. And I find I'm inclined to think that the second approach is much more, you get that sort of intuitive connection again. It's I think the logic becomes unself-conscious. There's a difference between self-conscious logic and when things just get absorbed. I mean,
I think that's great. I think the unself-conscious logic, it's a brilliant way of saying it, because if you're driving a car and you're driving a stick shift car, or what we call a manual in the UK, it becomes unconsciously logical that to gain more traction and more torque in the engine, you would actually go down a gear from fourth to third. But you don't actually consciously, logically process that after you've learned. You're actually intuitively getting that. But when you're learning to drive a car, the driving instructor is saying, okay, now change into second, now change into third, now change into fourth. And I can't remember learning why I needed to change gear. I remember just being told that I had to change gear, and eventually you can post-rationalize it and say, if I'm going up a really steep hill and the engine actually there's not enough torque in the engine in fourth gear, then dropping down to third will mean that I can actually get more power to go up the hill. But even that isn't really the engineering angle of what that really means. Even now it's not really logical. It just seems to make sense.
Oh yeah, I mean, and it's that sort of thing. I mean, I think logic is one of those things that varies from situation to situation, and I think logic, the logic of the situation should work under the surface. The more abstract things should drive the whole process. The imagination, the creativity, the interaction, the intuition, I think these should be the driving forces. The logic should be operating under the surface to, you summon it up when it's needed, kind of, because...
Yes. And I mean, are we being as rebellious enough to say that this actually is a relatively transformational point on how education could be adjusted to say, I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, but it's quite a revolutionary standpoint to say, hold a minute, guys, we've kind of got education the wrong way around.
It potentially is, but then who's to say that there aren't people already trying such approaches? I mean, I haven't actually been in classes. I haven't been in a class for a long time, but it seems to me that this might be, especially a language like ancient Greek or Latin, it might make it more fun to learn if you're just and if you're constantly being tested by software, and you compete, it's and the thing about Duolingo is you're competing with other people around the world as well. So so there's that competitive element to it, and I don't know how many of them are actually bots who just who keep sneaking ahead of you just so you can use the app more often.
True.
But there's all this stuff, and all of a sudden, like suddenly when you're in the middle of drinking coffee or taking a walk outside, you find yourself describing something on the street in Latin, and then you find out, oh, you got that perfect, and that's actually a good feeling when that happens.
That's true. There's a contact of mine called Shaolin, and Shaolin is a female entrepreneur who created something called Chinesey. And Chinesey is an award-winning Chinese learning methodology now. She's absolutely nailed it. I remember 10 years ago when she kind of, when I first met her and she was telling me about this concept, that it is trivializing Chinese into stories.
Oh yeah.
Stick figures that are actually the characters of the Chinese alphabet.
Wow.
And so you're learning, and it looks like a kid's book, and by mistake you end up learning Chinese. But there is a school of thought that says that that is not traditional enough, and trivializing this into a kind of stick figure cartoon-esque position means that you're missing out on the historical significance. And it's like, no.
I mean, it's kind of, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to read classical texts in the original.
Yeah.
And if I start off in the traditional ways, it's going to be 10 years after I can do that, probably. So
yeah. Yeah, and actually you've made, this is a very big point, I think, is that I rarely would find a translated text to have the same contextual substance than the
original. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues with the kind of, I'd say, the Sanskrit, the kind of some of the original Sanskrit texts.
Yeah,
is that the English translations are very two-dimensional. They only have a literal translation of something to another, and that's that actually forced me into the desire to kind of really try and understand Sanskrit in a more fundamental perspective, and that makes Latin look like a walk in the park, by the way, of course.
Well, I've purchased a new translation of the Upanishads, the Sanskrit philosophical text in English by Penguin. And the translator claims to have been faithful to the original. And then when I started reading the translation, most of it made no sense whatsoever. I mean, a lot of it, there's lots of context in there.
And that's it, isn't it? It's the context part. So you could be faithful in terms of words, but some of the things we're talking about here were written around the axial age of multiple important, retrospectively important esoteric events happening, either mythological or physical, and it's very, very difficult. It's like someone in 100 years reading about COVID-19.
Yeah.
Or when we read about the Black Death, or the, any of these, Spanish flu, and we read about it, and we read that 100 million people were wiped out, or 30 million people were affected, or whatever. And it's very hard, in a similar way to walking around London. My father tells me that, because he grew up during the bombings in the Second World War. So he was a schoolboy as the bombs were landing, and his dad was actually in the war. And so he says, oh, this whole part of South London was flattened. And you look down this street of tree-lined street with white 5-floor houses owned by millionaires. And it's very, very difficult to understand what the term flattened means, because flattened, we imagine, just means kind of flat. But what that also meant is that there were people inside those buildings that were flattened. So it also means death, which means loss. And then there's a multifaceted kind of removal of life.
Yeah.
So when the word flattened can be read from a Second World War perspective, or wiped out, it almost trivializes the context.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because in French there's a word called sosie, le sosie, which means which roughly equates to doppelganger. If you got a doppelganger, c'est ton sosie, and that actually comes from a play by Plautus, which involves twins of with mistaken identity. It's the Amphitryon, I think. It might be of the Menachmi.
Yeah.
So a play by the Roman playwright Plautus, in which one of the twins is called Sosia. Yes. I think it's the slave. So le sosie.
Yes.
So
that's right. It's the yes. I actually read a translation of this in a book called
Menachmi.
Yeah, I read it there's a book called A Companion to Plautus, actually. And the Plays of Mistaken Identity is the one about the twins. And I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? How we, or even that's a good example of whether the writer meant what they said literally or whether they meant what they said metaphorically.
Oh yeah.
And the words like the same are so generalized. So you could say, we had pretty much the same background, and it's actually meaningless in its generalization. Or we have so many similarities. It's like in perspective of what? So many is so subjective that if you're arranging out of 100 possible similarities, having 3 similarities is insignificant. But if you're arranging out of 5 similarities, having 3 is well over half. So I'm concerned about the lack of context in two-dimensional texts.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, if you can learn the original language, and then you look at historical. There are these romantic tales of how people have actually deciphered languages. Henry Cressick Rawlinson, who deciphered the cuneiform script. They had no Duolingo, and all those fascinating minds that used to exist in those days.
Unreal. I feel you and I both would have suited those years.
I think so. There's a lot less noise then. I think that's the key element.
I would say there's two. I would say that's one side of the coin, and I would say the other side of the coin is a lot more meaning.
Yeah.
And they are twins, actually, to riff on the Plautus. But the volume of noise and the lack of meaning therein has. If I were to be more negatively minded about the human race, I would say that we've kind of lost our way so much more now.
Oh yeah.
But then on the other hand, I am reminded by my more spiritually aware friends that what we class as lack of meaning could equally be new meaning. Even though it seems trivialized, is my son's interaction on Snapchat with his friends, which is to me nonsensical, pictures of rap album sleeves and sneakers, might mean nothing to me, but might mean masses to their social graph.
It's almost another language that, and if you had to sort of translate that into written language, you get the same sort of two-dimensional text.
Yeah, you'd get so then I sent him a picture of my sneakers and he sent me back a picture of his favorite album, and you read that and go, this is meaningless to anyone, but the sneakers that he was sending are the sneakers that his idol was wearing when his idol was assassinated, and the sneakers actually stand for the entire movement of rebellion against a system that was tuned to wipe out the species. And so we look at the word sneakers and a picture, and it means something that actually we couldn't translate, maybe.
Well, it's interesting though. I mean, do you think that suppose we were to progress along these lines, suppose that at some point we'll end up with a pictorial script once again? I mean, it's like, do you think language will be again transformed? We'll move on to a pictorial script of some sort.
Funnily enough, that's exactly what Chinese has done. It's you couldn't get nearer to hieroglyphics.
True. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I find that, I mean, my partner is an amazing digital artist, and actually an amazing artist, but she's found her new direction in digital art, which, with an Apple Pencil and an iPad, and I can gain now more understanding of what she's trying to express through a digital piece of art than if someone else were to express it in written words. Although she's also brilliant in the written word as well. But I think to me, I get quite excited by the dimensions of digital art. Rembrandt, for instance, his in the National Portrait Gallery in the UK, my favourite two Rembrandts in the Rembrandt room were his two self-portraits, one as a young man and one as an old man. And they are done pretty much in the same kind of slightly side-on, face-forward angle of this much. The picture's only about the same size as your computer screen. And the detail, especially the hope and ballsy confidence in the young man, kind of foolish pride, but slightly stupid because he doesn't know enough yet, versus the old man who has watched his life's dreams being dismantled, and what he had hoped would be good turned out to be not good. And all of this is to a static picture.
Wow.
And you don't actually need to know anything about Rembrandt to read that information of two pictures that are just a face.
Yeah.
There's no book that you would need chapters and chapters and chapters to describe the way that the reflection in his eye is showing loss of hope and abandonment. It's crazy.
Wow. Oh, what's this picture again?
These are the two Rembrandt portraits, and the self portraits. So it's it's the first. There's dozens, of course, by Rembrandt, and but I think the one that is the most amazing, I think, were the two that were taken by the National Portrait Gallery. And there's a big gap between the pictures. The last one that he did was in 1658, I believe. But yeah, I think that it's just something that couldn't be described as in words. And so if you look at the 1629 oil panel painting of his, that versus the kind of any of the final ones. If you go to the 1669 or the 1659, which is on loan to the National Gallery in Scotland right now, it's in the eyes, man. And you can't. The words in a book wouldn't land. But yes, so Rembrandt self-portraits in the Wikipedia show you the whole of his range.
Yeah, no, I just saw it. It looks pretty. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, yeah, I am a sucker for that old sort of, a lot of that old school stuff, particularly a lot of the Renaissance masters. And you see, mainly because of their expressions, there's a sense of, I think, innocence in their innocence. That's a discovery, a sense of discovery. Whether you see, for example, the Fall of Venus or the School of Athens, School of Athens is full of, this sort of aura of discovery and learning, and it's that kind of stuff.
Isn't that fantastic that the innocence and the wide-eyed curiosity of a Renaissance?
Yes,
because they didn't know. It's similar to the early Rembrandt. He's innocent but confident, and then as the years go on in his self-portraits, which were always him, he drew them. He painted them in a mirror, so they're all mirror images. And just over the years, the innocence just gets mutilated, and eventually this hollow. As he died, I think he was 63 or 64 years old. Just this gradual demise of hope. But I do like that in the Renaissance art that really describes things. But your original question was, could we move back to a pictorial expression and rather than a written word? I would.
That'd be a good thing.
I think it would be. I don't have a lot of faith in the 250,000 words, 70,000 common phrases, natural language construct of Latin-based languages. I don't think that they have the nuance that pictorial expression has, or musical expression. But that's not to poo-poo any language. That's just that I think we need to have multiple senses on top of that two-dimensional pen and paper or whatever. But secondly, I would stretch it to say that what we could move into is an addition of some form of feeling-based translation. So rather than expressing something as a picture or a line of text and then also a pictorial progression, if we could extend that to how something feels. So, for instance, I know that my friends are in Italy at the moment. Two of my friends, boyfriend and girlfriend, they're in Italy, and they heard that me and my partner were on our travels, and they got really excited about it and thought, let's go to Italy. We're going to go to Italy and just take a month out and see what happens. Now, that's the story. That's the story that we know.
Right.
But I don't know what they felt like when they made that decision. I don't know whether they felt a sense of longing of freedom or whether they felt a frustration from the lockdown. And so could we have a language that explains that feeling in a more exact term than, oh yeah, we heard that you were going on your travels and we're going to Italy too? Because that doesn't express anything.
I see what you mean. I've been thinking about this, and this is one of the reasons. I was telling you about the book I was reading about when set in Egypt, on the verge of Rommel's invasion, and it's a work of fiction. It's literary fiction, but one of the things I've gotten so much out of it about the Second World War that I would have out of a work of history. For example, because of all the emotions that are expressed in descriptiveness. So maybe I think a pictorial script could have achieved that same effect if you were writing a history, or.
I totally. I mean, if you were that Rommel example or the Second World War, let's take the Second World War as a theme, and the Suez Canal trade routes as a theme, which is that era and that issue that was going on with royal intervention eventually. It would be so much more contextually relevant to understand the feelings. I mean, if you go to a there's a place called Clink, I think, in London, on the where the Tower of London prisons, the dungeons were, London dungeons, right? And on that tour, you go into the London dungeons, and the lights go off, and they pipe this horrible rotten cabbage smell through the air system, and they turn the heating off, and they've got a soundtrack of kind of clinking chains, and they say, this is, imagine this for 4 weeks, and then you get hanged off the bridge, right? And I must admit, you do get a sense of, in the same as in Alcatraz, when they used to do, I don't know if they still do Alcatraz tours, but you were allowed to go into a cell and they'd lock the cell.
Yeah. Oh, right. Oh, wow.
And those type of experiential angles are a great way of communicating. I believe that we would have less racism if people could experience what it's like to be on the other end of it. And I believe that we would push each other less in a crowd if we've experienced, let's say, wearing some kind of haptic suit that has pressure points. If we experience what it's like to be under a crowd as it's heaving above you and you're unable to breathe, I think you would probably have a different perspective of what it's like, and therefore you wouldn't be so aggressive maybe in a crowd. Or the feeling of loss, if you could experience loss, or if you could actually quantify what it would mean if you died, to all those around you, and to all of the hope and opportunity you felt that you wanted to leverage, but you then weren't able to because you had a day left. If you could actually experience that now, how would you live? How would you live next? You know, and none of that comes from written words.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember in school having to read, again, back to history, and, reading these anecdotes like so-and-so captured so-and-so king and then tortured him to death, just mentioned as a fact. And then you're saying, hang on, you can't just stop there and move on to the next fact. You've got to get into the details of what actually happened. You can't use the word torture and just, just stop there.
Yeah, but then and then in educational context, how do you know which parts to shorten, to abridge? Do you I'm with you. If someone says, and then this king was tortured to death, and then his brother took the throne, it's like, okay, so a lot of shit happened there in 2 lines. But how much do you abridge? Where do you abridge? Do you abridge at the point where you believe the reader or the student understands what they need to understand, which in an educational context is the syllabus says, understand the succession of the Tudors? Or do you, as a teacher stroke parent, stroke educator in general, think, well, it's less important to understand the succession of the kings and the queens in that case. It's more important to understand why these things happened. And, the wiping out of the pygmies, and the reason why leprechauns are what they are in Ireland is actually an entire genocidal backstory that no one knows about, really. I've met 2 people ever who know about what went down, the abuse against very small people. And no, we don't need to know about it, but we do need to know that Henry VIII had 6 wives, and these were the 2 that weren't, this divorce, beheaded, something else, whatever. And which bits are we supposed to learn? How do you make the judgment of what we're supposed to learn and which should be abridged?
Well, I mean, to an extent, I feel like if you just state things like beheadings and tortures as facts in one line, I mean, this was not how the person experienced it. I think you're sort of normalizing these things and making people, oh, this is just a normal thing, that you move on. But it's the person who got tortured was held in a cellar for weeks and weeks, and probably had bits of his body, was constantly impaled and had bits of decapitated slowly around, and stretched on a rack, and all those things over weeks, and had to live in had to experience the most grueling pain, and probably became comatose by the end of it or whatever. So I mean, if you're going to teach that, go the whole hog. I mean, teach the whole.
Yeah, I'm of that mindset, I must admit. I think there's another point in this, which is, if you're gonna go the whole hog, then also look at the ontology of it and the actual genesis,
right,
of why.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of my themes. I mean, I don't think I've ever done a Think Up talk without mentioning this. That are we not talking about why people hate and why people love? Are we not really? We're talking about why we do what we do, and if we're driven as humans by greed and fear, which elements were at play when this gradual torture happened, because it's going to be down to greed and fear. It's going to be down to some form of risen control that comes, arguably, as Robert Wright says in Why Buddhism is True. He makes a very solid claim that we have one overlord, and that is natural selection. Right. And we're driven by survival to such an extent, and the pre-population of our gene pool, that we will do anything to survive.
I do feel that, though, when you're a human being, it's we have a choice. We can choose that to be our overlord, or we can try to enter the human struggle, which is transcending that overlord. I mean, the fact that not to be ruled by fear, choosing not to be ruled by fear. I think that there is that aspect of the human journey as well.
Well, actually, Robert Wright is making a point that what you've just said is actually the conclusion of Why Buddhism is True, is that he's saying, we have one Lord of natural selection that is instilled, and, you're meant to get married and you have your kids, you're meant to go to work for the man, you're meant to be a compliant factory worker. And if someone, and if you don't have kids, it's like, oh, didn't want to have kids, or you couldn't have kids. There must be something a bit wrong with you. And this installation of normality, it supports our natural physical drive to populate the world with our genes and to defend that, right? And I think what he's saying is we have a choice not to be a slave of that,
right?
And to deprogram ourselves from greed and fear results in what especially the Western interpretations of Buddhism is, but a lot of the Eastern definitions as well. And so the truth in Buddhism that he writes about is that it is that the general constructs are the opposite of being a slave to the overlord of natural selection. And it's a strong argument. It's a very strong argument, I think. My concern about it is that I rarely hear people talk about Buddhism in a traditional context. I hear about Buddhism in the Western context, which is all the good bits, none of the bad bits, and basically peace, love among beings, and Om. And you tend to be into yoga as well. It's
all done. I mean, I think there's a tendency to dumb things down generally, and Buddhism is one of those things that suffered the dumbing down industry a hell of a lot. But somewhat similar to Buddhism is the Advaita philosophy of, that's Buddhism plus some metaphysics involved. Is how you could describe it. The philosophy in the Upanishads, and to an extent in the Bhagavad Gita, that kind of thing. And so those are, and there's that suggestion over there that for some reason humanity is being human is the ultimate test. You've had all these animal births or whatever, and finally you're a human being, and you have the choice.
Yeah.
Whether to be a human or an animal, but then the point is, the way human beings do animal isn't in a really animal way, because animals do what they do as instinct. They're part of that cycle. They don't transcend that, whereas humans coach their animal instincts with intelligence.
Yes.
So that's sophisticated torture techniques and all that.
I mean, you've put that in a very, that's a very generous way of describing it, and I like that, because that's more productive than the more negative ways of saying it. I mean, I could, you're right. I mean, animals, non-human animals are more unconditional, and
they just do things instinctively.
Totally, and this applied sense of hierarchy and arguably genetic terrorism that humans have cast upon the entire animal kingdom and the world is then classed as intelligence, which that would be my version of saying it. So I think we're going to stick with your version of saying it.
Well, I mean, if you say, if a cat tortures a mouse, it's probably not for more than 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's human beings would put someone in a cellar and torture them for months.
Decades. For decades. Yeah, I think our capability for imaginative behavior,
Yeah.
knowing that there isn't a species that can beat us. I mean, I've always, the reason why I don't like big game hunting.
All right. Yeah.
Is that it's not necessarily because I'm so kind of like, hey man, all life is equal. Because if it was, then I equally wouldn't eat root vegetables or anything else like that. But the reason I don't like big game hunting is because it's not fair.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not because it's killing animals. It's because my view is, if you walk into a park where there's elephants and you've got a giant gun, or there's tigers and lions and you've got a giant gun, I'm all for you walking in there without a gun.
Right.
And you go there and you want to, let's say you want a tiger skin. Okay, cool, no worries. Go get a tiger skin without a gun.
Right. Yeah.
Go for it. And I would applaud that. I'm totally fine with that. I think each to their own. And if you don't value life, or you do value life, or whatever, but at least have the decency to make it a fair fight. And if you want to kill a great white shark, you go into the water and try and kill a great white shark with your teeth.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a fair game.
Well, I mean, potentially you could use a knife. You want to wrestle a tiger with a knife, you could give that a shot.
Yeah, because they've got claws.
Yeah.
I'll take that. I'll take a small knife. What I won't take is a giant, great, big land-to-air missile to kill an elephant, because it's just like walking into a boxing ring against someone who's got a bulldozer. It's just not, there's, and then we have these trophy shots of what we've killed with our giant gun, and it's like, how?
It's appalling.
Yeah, that's what gets me. It's not actually about the fact that they killed an animal, to be honest.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, you play within nature's laws, but I mean, there's also the philosophy behind it. If you're going to kill for meat, there's one thing. If you're going to kill to sustain your family and yourself, and or even just to eat, if it's going to be eaten. If you're not going to eat, what's the use of taking a life?
I'm of that philosophy to quite an extent. I don't mind if someone wants to fish because they want to feed their family. I think go for it and fish away. I have no moral problem with you fishing to feed your family. And what I would prefer is that you fish in an ethical way, rather than trawling the entire 1 million tuna or 10 million shrimp in an excavation site, which is not dissimilar to wiping out an entire rainforest and then selling it on for profit. It seems very wrong to me. But yeah, if you want to fish and then bring home a fish to the family and everyone eats the fish, I think that's kind of I'm of the mindset that that's why the fish are there.
Yeah. Wow, it is such an ugly world. We can't help but be participants in the ugliness. I mean, at least in the past you had a choice not to, but because of everything being connected and everything, however much you choose not to be part of the process, you do end up being part of it.
Yeah, and then my dad would say that. I mean, he used to say this when I was much younger, and then I didn't get it until I was at least 30, and then I kind of processed it over the next 10 years, and then from 40 to 46 or 47, I think I am now. I spent most of the time understanding what he meant. He said that you get decreasingly shocked by real life over time, and so you start in ignorance, and then you learn what's really going on, and then you get shocked a bit, and you get shocked less, because you actually eventually realize that you don't really know very much, and actually you then create a bubble of which you're okay with, and it can be full of hypocrisy. So you can be pro this but evidently not pro that, or anti that, but compliant with it. You can say that the government are a bunch of idiots and still do things that enable the government to get away with being idiots. And he said, you just form a framework of hypocrisy, and provided you're okay with it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you had to, I mean, the whole thing about is, suppose you actually had to look at your own role in all of this, things become a lot clearer, right? I mean, that's part of you, like you said about governments being idiots. But let's say you have the new atheists, for example, going about saying that religion starts war. Now, that's a very convenient thing because there hasn't been a religious war for ages, and you're basically kind of attacking something for causing human misery that you're not part of, which is very convenient. But if you had to look at consumerism and industrialism and capitalism and communism and all these things causing wars, and then all of a sudden you become part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right, and it's the best move of lack of accountability. Equally, when you are of a strong faith, I've noticed.
Yeah, exactly.
You would say that that it's, you know, if you speak to it, some of the Hindu friends of mine say that the Muslims are responsible for everything.
Oh yeah, and you know, the Muslims will go to say that, you know, Hindus don't believe in the wrong God. I mean, they don't even matter. They're sort of believe in the wrong false gods.
Yeah, false gods. The India-Pakistan conflicts are almost seemingly never ending. But I think on the point of the lack of accountability, we as humans tend to try and deflect accountability, maybe out of survival. I mean, if we actually look at what really does cause wars, it's humans.
Oh,
and so if we're all complicit. And it's not a nice thing to feel like, because it would be much easier for me to say it's Catholics because I'm not one.
I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not as though Alexander the Great waged a war in Christ's name 300 years before Christ was born, or, you know, it's
yeah. I know it's weird. I think that's maybe to full circle this conversation as we draw to a close. I think what we've now uncovered essentially is that there's context, there's deeper context behind things, and reading words. So if you read a word from an atheist propaganda machine saying all religions are the things that cause wars, that written in a two-dimensional context looks A, like a fact, and B, like it has a self-justification mechanism, because you can't demand citation from propaganda. And so I think what we've kind of said many times now in this call in different ways is that without context and without some form of citations, it is very unlikely that communication of any form will be as representative enough of the real context. And therefore, written words over time may be aided if they are increased in their dimensional capacity. So not just one sentence, actually are built upon context.
I think one of my favorite examples, going back to the Latin experience of this, is, for example, the Latin for "do you like something" is "placet ne tibi." Does it please you?
That's right.
So, I mean, I think that's an interesting sort of thing about how people saw so, you know, does what I've cooked please you, or do you like it?
Exactly. I like how there's the constructs in Latin tend to be very, very.
Does it not please you?
That's right.
It's actually placet ne tibi.
Indeed. Yeah. And it's and the first person context is much more absolute, I find, and I like that. But I think we may have trivialized these things. I mean, you know, someone can have a child, and then someone can respond saying LOL or a heart, and sending a heart emoji used to maybe be a written letter on horseback delivered, and now is a heart emoji via a message. So yeah, we may have lost some context along the way.
Oh yeah, big. I mean, it goes back to, someone got so, someone got caught, captured, and tortured. One sentence, as though that's all.
Yeah. Anyway, good. Well, Prashant, thank you so much for this. This has been a good mental workout, and
Likewise.
I can't wait to see what we talk about next on our seemingly infinite journey around thought, and because there's a lot of content to go through, man. I mean, we're talking about language forms of context, but we didn't really dwell on the reason why education structures are so limited, and whether or not that's a form of abuse to students who may have a civil right to understand. But
well, I've got a thought for that to put for the reason it's because I think it's because we reduced everything to a resource, right? The fact that the companies have human resources is very telling. When you refer to and the fact that we exist just purely to work and consume, and everything must serve that purpose. So education is supposed to help us find a job. That's all it's supposed to do, not explore some intellectual horizons.
Yeah, and as I said in my 2014 talk or 2013 talk in Portugal, the TED talk I gave, I said, and the first line that came out of my mouth was, throughout history, populations have been best controlled by limiting the information they have access to.
Right, yeah.
And that's maybe should be the topic of our next talk.
Well, right now, it would seem that we're controlled by being bombarded with too much information. It's a weird kind of thing, too much useless information.
Precisely.
So we're controlled by being distracted by useless information, so that we won't go after relevant information.
As Neil Postman says, we are amusing ourselves to death. And as I said in my TED talk, we've been critically addicted to throwing birds at pigs and having our hearts hijacked by Grand Theft Auto.
Oh yes, yes, that's well put.
Thank you. And believe it or not, that was all improvised. The first 7 minutes of my TED Portugal talk in 2013 was directly off the top of my head, and I have never spoken more lucidly since, nor before, of anything that I thought that I've put well. I have over-engineered, whereas on that day, I opened my mouth and what I really thought came out. And my genuine concern in the trivialization and overabundance of meaningless information is something that I think I needed to say once, and I don't repeat it a lot now because I kind of said it, and I now kind of more wanting to be a lighthouse rather than a tugboat. But the first six or 7 minutes of the TED Porto talk in 2013 is actually what.
Is it on YouTube?
Yeah. You just put my name in. Yeah, just put in just my name, Jonathan MacDonald, and then TED Oporto, and then it's the first link. It's TED Oporto 2013.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's the first 6 minutes of that is actually what I think about all of this, and each month that goes by, including C19, including Trump, including Brexit, including Boris, all and the fake news. I just
think that life's become an Evelyn Waugh novel. I mean, I think it's the kind of I literally see absurdity everywhere.
I was going to go for either. Okay, I've got three. I would say Evelyn Waugh, the love child of Evelyn Waugh and Charles Dickens.
Potentially, yes.
Because I think that I think there's an absurdity, but there's a granularity of the human race in this that Dickens captures so well.
Right, yeah.
And if you mix the absurd lateralism with granular human behavior, and you do that, and then you overpopulate a planet with running out of natural resources, and then you hit the whole thing with C19 lockdown. That's the movie we're in.
Well, the other day I ventured out and wanted to see what the bars were like, and of course there's a social distancing, and I was being served by people wearing face masks, not just face masks with a covering. I thought there's definitely an even more novel and going on here.
Yeah. If there were cameras, maybe, if this is going to make one hell of a documentary. I've got to go. Prashant, thanks, mate. I shall speak to you again, no doubt.
Pleasure.
Cheers, dude. Take care out there.
You too.
See you, mate. Bye.